Greetings, Assalamu alaikum, welcome everyone. My name is Saqib, your host on the Hikmah Project podcast. Today we'll be talking about the great visionary, seer, poet, philosopher, thinker from the East, Muhammad Allama Iqbal. I've been a great fan and lover of his work for many years now and have really been looking forward to doing something on him for the Hikmah Project. And I was blessed and fortunate to have met Humaira Masihuddin, who is a lawyer based in Islamabad, is very widely read and studied. She holds degrees from the University of London, University of Pittsburgh, University of Leicester, International Islamic University, in law, in areas around law, anthropology, and shariah. And she has been a student of Iqbal and has been teaching Iqbal for over 2 decades. And it's very evident when she recites Iqbal, the enthusiasm rubs off, and the poetry that comes through really lands on the heart, on the ear of the heart, and has left me ecstatic. The whole podcast has been a real treat for me. So, just a few updates. We have launched a few membership plans which you may want to look at on the website to help support us. Thank you for those who are. We have been able to make the whole website free, so you can access all the content on the website, and any support you can offer is greatly appreciated. So in addition to the free plan, we also now have a supporting membership, a premium membership, and also an elite membership on various levels of support you may wish to give. We are planning to hopefully do a course on Iqbal. More details on that in due course. Just a heads up, in the podcast the poetry is recited in Urdu and some Persian, and we try and give a paraphrased sort of translation or explanation of the poems, but I'll do my best to actually hyperlink or include the original poems with their translations in the podcast notes, which you should be able to find on the website. So without further ado, here's the podcast. Welcome, Humaira, to the Hikmah Project podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Saqib.
It's an absolute pleasure for me. It's a long-standing project I've had to explore Iqbal on Hikmah, and I'm very, very grateful to you for giving up your time and offering, inshallah, your insights on Iqbal today.
Makes me very happy to be on your program, really.
So let's just start by maybe if you can just say briefly just about your background and how you got into Iqbal.
Okay, so my background is I'm a lawyer basically, and I studied anthropology and criminology as well. So I sort of combined the three, law, anthropology, and criminology, and I've been working as a consultant and a trainer and a teacher and as a lawyer. And the major portion of my work has been as a trainer, consultant within the criminal justice system of Pakistan. So.
Wow, amazing. And so how did you then develop an interest in Iqbal? Has that been since childhood or more recent?
It is actually, Saqib, growing up in the 70s and 80s of Pakistan, you just grew up with Iqbal. It wasn't like you got introduced at some point in your life with Iqbal. He was there all around us. He was there in our textbooks. He was there in the formal education, informal education. We had Shikwa, Jawab-e-Shikwa, Tarikh-ki-Dua. We had them in our texts. We knew those poems by heart. And then if he was on the main national television, PTV. And then if you went to the Republic Day parade, they would be reciting Iqbal. In fact, when the fighter jets would be coming, they would say, "Palatna jhapatna, palat ke jhapatna, lahu garam karne ka hai ek bahana." So there's so many verses of Iqbal that we never sat down and learned. They were just floating all around us. And, they just were a part of our existence, I would say. And he was a very favorite poet of ours. And when I say ours, I mean my generation. We would quote him in debates, in our daily lives.
And so you've taken it to another level because you run courses and have given talks on Iqbal. And so not many people of your generation have gone, that step extra. So what prompted that?
Actually, I used to read Iqbal for pleasure. And, to get Josh, the word Josh, I don't know how I would translate that word into English,
Enthusiasm,
to get inspired to, so we used to read Iqbal for inspiration and really it was pleasure reading, I would say. But in 2003, I came across this amazing chance. A friend of mine, her husband had an FM radio and he wanted some good content creation. I jumped at this opportunity and I think I might have done around 20 or more programs from this FM radio on Iqbal. And some of them were thematic, Iqbal's concept of ishq, and some of them were based on his poems like Shikwa, Jawabi Shikwa. I remember I did Tuluwe Islam in 5 segments. So, and that was the first time I studied Iqbal seriously. So I went out, bought books, Ghulam Rasool Meher's Tashri or his explanation of Iqbal's poetry. And that was the first time I really got introduced to Iqbal in depth. This was a serious study. And then another thing that really happened, I was just, this is destiny. And I'm so grateful to God for this, that around 2010, 7 years later, a teacher approached me from Shifa College of Medicine. And she told me to do something for the medical students. And you know how these modern classrooms, you have PowerPoint presentations and you have to have this, a certain speed with which you have to speak and all that. So I designed a workshop on khudi, self-actualization. And I took 3 passages from different books and different poems. One was, I still remember, it was Zindagi from Khizr-e-Ra, when Iqbal meets Khizr in his imagination and he asks him these questions. And one of them was, what is the reality of life? So I took up the passage on life from there. Then I went to Bale Jibreel and I took Ruhe Arzi Adam ka istiqbal karti hai. Like when a person is born, what is the message that is coming from Mother Earth to that child? The probabilities, the possibilities, what all life, the amazing opportunities that will come their way, And then I took a passage from Masjid-e-Qurtaba about, that is an amazing passage. It is about, I don't want to use the word perfect, but actually that is what Iqbal is saying, the perfect human being, Tujhse hua ashkar bandaye momin ka raz. And parts of it is, of course, inspired by the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam's personality, So I took these 3 passages and I put them together and then some rubayat on khudi. And then from then on, I've done it with several youth groups. And I do it on a yearly basis with Shifa College of Medicine. And we have like about 100 medical students in class every time. And I've done it in NUST and other universities and with other youth groups. So that is, how I got into a serious study of Iqbal.
And what's their response been for this new generation of students?
They are blown away. They are thirsting to study Iqbal. And I feel so sorry for this generation. And I don't say it and I'm not looking down on them or anything. They're far ahead of us in so many ways. But, I kind of feel that when they introduced O-levels in Pakistan, our government or some whatever policy making idara or institution or the Ministry of Education should have given them some guidelines, of these Western universities, bringing in courses and, holding exams in Pakistan, that you can't do this to our youth. So Urdu is now just taught as a language in O levels in Pakistan. So there is grammar, there's translation, there's a little bit of idioms, muhavara and all those things, muhavare, and there is absolutely no literature. And I was like kind of surprised when Shikwa Jawabi Shikwa was released by Coke Studio. I don't know if you've seen that. And a lot of our youth was so excited. Oh, I finally found out what Shikwa and Jawabi Shikwa is all about. And then I sat them down and I explained, this is a syncretism, and they have used in a Khabbali, they have used some verses of Shikwa Jawabi Shikwa. This is not Shikwa Jawabi Shikwa. So, and they were like, really? So I had a session last year. I teach law. I teach criminology and Islamic law at this institution called TMUC. So I got my students over to my place, and we did a session on Rumi, and then we did a session on Shikwa Jawabi Shikwa. And they just soak it up. They are so excited. They cannot believe that this is what in I feel so sorry, because this Iqbal is our treasure. He's our national treasure. He's not just our national treasure. I think he's this amazing person who can offer so much to the world today, to the entire world, and yet we in Pakistan are being deprived of his amazing insights, his verses, his poetry. It's a tragedy.
Well, let's see if we can explore some of those insights today with you, and inshallah maybe open up channels of exploring his wisdom and his treasure in the future. Let's begin, and I'll ask you to share some of your favorite poems with us later on. Let's just set the scene first. I think listeners who are interested in learning about the autobiography of Iqbal, I'm sure there's many resources available online, so we won't delve into that necessarily. But let me pose the question as in who is Iqbal, in that is he merely a poet alongside the Urdu tradition of Mir and Ghalib and Faiz? Does he offer us something more? Is he an Islamic thinker? I'm just putting out boxes here because I feel it doesn't fit in any of them, strictly speaking. So, but I'll put the boxes there. Is he an Islamic thinker? We know he wrote some 6 lectures in his Reconstruction of Religious Thought and a stray notebook, which was published later. Was he an Islamic thinker in the line of Shah Waliullah Dehlvi, who was the first person to have the Quran translated into Persian? And so he's looking at this way of meeting the challenges of modernity after in the line of Sir Sayyid Ahmad Khan. Or was he a Sufi? Some of his verses, as I'm sure we'll see, are very esoteric. He's hum kalam, or at one in dialogue with the divine, and say some really bold statements which really wake you up or shake you to the core. Was he somebody who sort of had a fixation on the golden era of Islam? And he has a lot to say. There's a verse coming, I better recite it. He says, and for the listeners, I'll try and put a translation in the notes, so apologies if I can't give you a translation now, but ta khilafat ki bina dunya mein ho fir ustwar la kahin se dhundkar aslaf ka qalb o jigar.
Beautiful.
And so he had, so he's talking about the aslaf and having, the basis for transformation in the world, this idea of having a khalifa or a khilafa. In order to carry that on, you really need the qalb and the jigar, the heart and the liver, the courage of the aslaf, the salaf, the earliest
ancestors, our ancestors.
Yeah. And so he has a lot to sort of share on early Islamic history, but at the same time, he's somebody who really went and lived in the West, but sought very deeply into Western culture and civilization. and was able to critique it, quite
Big time. Big
quite
time.
big time. Yeah. And so he has a lot to say on that. So, or does he offer something else? There's a realm of higher poetry, which is, I guess, when we speak of Rumi, who are not just merely poets, it's almost an inspired state of poetry that offers some sort of universal language and meaning that, people of all different backgrounds and different times and eras can still read it and resonate. So those are some labels and boxes. Where do you see him? What does he mean to you, and what
He
relevance?
is each and every of those labels and each and every of those boxes. He is a historian. Oh my goodness, the depth with which he looks at events, goes to the root causes. He is a philosopher. He is a linguist. I recently discovered, like last year, that he defended his PhD thesis in German. And that's a very difficult language to learn. And he was only in Europe for 3 years. Can you imagine? So Punjabi, Urdu, English, Arabic, Persian, and German. So this person is phenomenal, and he is not just a philosopher, sitting in his room, just doing ideas. He's out there fighting elections, walking on the roads of Lahore, getting elected to the Legislative Assembly, or was it? It was like a forum, one of those forums. I don't quite exactly remember the name of that forum, but he had to fight an election to be on that forum. He is all those things, and he's a teacher. He's a teacher. He started his career as a teacher. He was even, what do you say, visiting lecturer at the University of London. He was filling in for someone, and he was lecturing in Arabic language. So my goodness, and I was reading his biography, Saqib, and it was so amazing that the father and his elder brother decided that he had so much potential, and they were not from a very rich or privileged family. So they said, we will fund his education. They put all their resources together, but Iqbal's father put a condition. He said, your education should serve Muslim cause. You should be able to serve your millat, your nation. So on his deathbed, when his father was dying, Iqbal went and asked him, he said, was I able to do what you had asked me to do? And his father said yes. And he witnessed this amazing, that you did fulfill the condition that I had set for. This is just amazing. They could see his potential. And so he is he's the spiritual father of the Pakistan movement. And when I was reading his biography written by Javed Iqbal, his own son, and he had access to all the records, the historical records, what happened during the Muslim League years, how he influenced Quaid-e-Azam Muhammad Ali Jinnah, how and when and on and which year Quaid-e-Azam Muhammad Ali Jinnah and Allama Iqbal came on the same page. Until Allama Iqbal died, Allama Iqbal and Quaid-e-Azam remained on the same page, which is a difficult thing to do in politics. So they had one vision, and look at how the concept in his Allahabad address, was it that he gave the concept of Pakistan in 1930. So he is each and every one of those labels, and he lived a short life, like in his early 60s. He died in his early 60s, but his travels, his going to Palestine, his visit to Egypt, how he inspired so many Muslims all over the Muslim world who were all engaged in the fight against colonialism and imperialism and fighting freedom. Freedom. They were engaged in freedom struggles. It's just amazing. Just reading his biography was so overwhelming for me. I did it about a year and a half ago, and it was a very heavy read, because it was like every little detail, where he went, what he said, where he made which speech. It was just amazing to pack so much in a short life and to have such a great impact. I think he is one of those. Iqbal says, हजारों साल नरगिस अपनी बेनूरी पे रोती है, बड़ी मुश्किल से होता है चमन में दीदावर पैदा, and he is that man. Actually, probably he's talking about himself. It's just amazing. He's each and every one of those things that you described.
MashaAllah. And I would just like to emphasize one of those labels, if we want to use that term, is that, you know, although he talks about Nietzsche and, you know, he had a PhD and, you know, he went to Cambridge and, you know, he's regarded as very important Islamic thinker, very creative, innovative. There seems to be, you know, and having read some Ghalib and, you know, Urdu, as well as some Persian poetry in Sadi, Hafiz, Rumi, you know, there's a beautiful line there, lineage there of this Indo-Pak Iranian sort of poetical tradition. And we know he wrote, as Ghalib did, in both Farsi and Urdu. In fact, maybe his Farsi was more beautiful or more, you know, as rich, if not more than the Urdu. Is that there seems to be something which Sohail Umar Saab refers to, you know, the head, who was the head of this Allama Iqbal Academy, refers to in one of his talks, maybe you can find it on YouTube, as higher poetry that deals with metaphysics, you know, like Blake and others. And there seems to be something that when you recite his poems, they don't just land on the mind. They go, it's not just an idea. There's something that penetrates. He's offering a level of vision on Islamic principles or Quranic principles and history, which sometimes the ulama, the scholars, aren't able to convey, or they rely on him at times, or on in Friday sermons. I know in Pakistan often, you know, you could hear somebody reciting some poems of Iqbal, but the proof of this is not only is he endorsed by the ulama, the scholars, the traditional scholars who regard him in very, you know, as an Allama, you know, a very learned person. For me, one interesting person is Dr. Israr Ahmed, the late Dr. Israr Ahmed, who thought of his, I mean, he's a religious scholar, but he wanted to be known as Iqbal's adopted son. His you know, he said, I would like to be known. And he was so immersed in Iqbal, and he would be giving talks on the Quran and Iqbal, and he just said there is no parallel to Iqbal in Islamic history. And that to me says volumes, that, you know, his level of endorsement by the ulama, of the traditional ulama, who see what he's talking about and are saying that this level of insight and calling of the Quran is unprecedented. We don't have it. God gave it to him. And I think that's what I want to try to emphasize, this side of him, which was a visionary. You know, he saw beyond his current time. He saw into the depth of history, into the depth of the Quran, and was able to bring out these things and convey it in his poems. And sometimes that gets lost. You know, I'm just saying, you can analyze and start talking about his ideas, but what he's doing is for me anyway, he's going into that realm of higher poetry. Am I correct? Do you?
You are absolutely correct, because I'll share a very interesting detail from Allama Iqbal's life. He couldn't look at blood. He was not able to look at blood. So when they would be offering sacrifice or something in the house, he would make his son Javed stand over there. So he used to become unconscious, and people would say, Allama, you write about the battlefield, and you write about dasht to dasht hai, dariya bhi na chhode humne, behre zulmat mein dauda diye ghode humne. Here you can't even look at blood. And how do you do this? And he said, when I'm writing poetry, I am stepping into another realm. So there was this creative fury that he had. And Javed describes that even in winters, when he had this, he would start getting inspired, and this poetry would start coming to him, ilham. He would sit up and he would become so agitated, and then he would call out for the pen and the paper. And then once he would write it down, he would calm down. So anyone who has ever written or even had any slight interaction with poetry, serious interaction, they know it's not from this realm in the first place. It is from another realm. It comes from another realm. And we all know that. And those of us who have maybe written some poetry and studied poetry, we know that it is an exercise which is inspired. In fact, I think Allama Iqbal's teacher asked him, was it Matthew Arnold or was it some other? It was probably Arnold. And he said, Iqbal, you're so educated, you're studying philosophy. Even you think that the Quran was revealed? And Allama Iqbal said, poems are, come down on me. And he said something like, and here you're talking about the Quran. I totally believe that it is it's a revelation, because मेरे ऊपर पूरी पूरी poems उतरती हैं, like I'm inspired to write this poetry. So that is what he was conveying. And this point that you made about him being so deeply immersed in the Quran, so true. Like somebody with even very little knowledge of the Quran, and if they have read Iqbal, they can immediately spot where a certain idea or a certain verse is coming from. And if you would like, I would like to share a couple of examples from there.
Yes.
Okay. You know that in that poem, Khizr-e-Rah, in which he asks Khizr the reality of life. And Khizr goes, Bartaraz adleshaye sudozaya hai zindagi. है कभी जहाँ और कभी तस्लीम जहाँ है जिंदगी. So what are you talking about? The life is far more than andesha-e sudo-zaya. It's not it's not am I making a profit? Am I making a gain? Am I going to, if I do this thing, am I going to suffer a loss? This thing is so mysterious. Sometimes living is life. Sometimes giving up your life is life. And this is like literally to me, it seems like a literal translation of that ayah of the Quran. وَلَا تَحْسَبَنَّ الَّذِينَ قُتِلُوا فِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ أَمْوَاتٍ. Don't even think, don't even think, وَلَا تَحْسَبَنَّ الَّذِينَ قُتِلُوا فِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ, that those who are killed in the path of God, amwat, that they are dead, walahya, they are alive. They are being given risk and sustenance, and they are alive. So literally, you can see the whole concept, the way Iqbal takes it from the Quran and puts it into his verse. Another thing that fascinates me is also the last verse, the last share of this passage on life, Zindagi. He says, Kulzume hasti se tu ubra hai manande habab. That you are like a bubble in the ocean of existence. Is ziya khane mein tera imtihan hai zindagi. In this place of wasting, your imtihan, your test is zindagi. And immediately you go to wal asr innal insana lafi khusr. By the passing of time, indeed, man is in manifest loss. Calling dunya ziya khana, a place where you suffer loss, where you are in khasara. It's like literally you can feel, you can just feel the way he captures the Quranic concept. It just flows out of him. I think it's basically cream in and cream out. Because I had read somewhere or I had heard somewhere that Allama Iqbal, one thing, it's very important, that every day Allama Iqbal's father used to call him and ask him, do you read the Quran? And he would say yes. And then he would repeat the question the next day and the next. And then I think after he had asked him a sufficient number of times, he said, read the Quran as if it is being revealed to you, as if it is coming down on you. And I think Iqbal must have engaged in that exercise, because I think I heard somewhere it was once or it was often, I cannot say for sure, but that when he read the Quran, it became wet because he used to weep so much. And then they had to take it out in the sun and dry it. I don't know if it happened once, but just to give you an example of how he engaged with the Quran. So it's a simple equation of cream in, cream out. What's going in is coming out.
Beautiful. With your permission, I'd just like to share two stories that have come to mind.
Please.
And you can correct me or elaborate on them as needed. One is his philosophy on khudi, self. I'd just like to maybe as a side note say he also wrote about the Asrar Khudi and Rumuz Bekhudi, the secrets of selflessness. So, but I'll just put that as a side note to anyone listening. So he was asked, where did you get this philosophy of self, about cultivating the self? I think it was a journalist. And he was asked whether he took it from Nietzsche's Superman, who Iqbal critiques, or who admires but critiques as well.
People say that, yes, and it's such a.
And he said, come tomorrow, and I'll tell you. So he goes to visit, and Iqbal asks his helper or servant to bring out the Quran, and the guy is amazed, thinking, I've asked him for the source of his khudi, and he pulls out the Quran, and he recites one of the last ayahs from Surah Al-Hashr. وَلَا تَكُونُوا كَالَّذِينَ نَسُوا اللَّهَ فَأَنْسَاهُمْ أَنفُسَهُمْ أُولَٰئِكَ هُمُ الْفَاسِقُونَ. Do not become like those who have forgotten God, and Allah has made them forgetful of their own selves.
Wow.
And he says, this is the crux of my khudi. The other one was, I think we should say a bit about his father. The beautiful story, I've heard that as well, about reading the Quran as though it's being revealed to you. There's a poem that he says that came to mind is, Tere zamir par tak na ho nuzul kitab, gira kasha hai, na razi na sahib kashaf. So until the Quran isn't, there is zamir par tak na ho nuzul kitab. So zamir, conscience, or on your consciousness, until the book isn't revealed on your, doesn't penetrate your being. In other words, the gira kashah, the knot is tied. You may be a Razi, or like a Fakhruddin Razi, or the author of Sahib Kashaf, Zamakhshari, I think.
Zamakhshari? Okay, I didn't know these two.
Yeah, and so you could be a commentator on the Quran and have elaborate commentaries, but unless it penetrates your being, the knot remains tied. And I think that's a really important principle, because he's undoing knots essentially in his poems. He's not just giving commentaries on what happened. He's not doing it at the conceptual level. They're penetrating insights.
And that's why I think they penetrate the soul. When you read them, more than you understand them, it's just you feel them.
Yes. Can I just say about his father, for listeners, if you were to Google pictures of his parents, they're very, very amazing looking at, just the face of his father, the piety in his, and I've heard that he would hold circles in his house. He was like an unlettered Sufi, and he would hold circles on the Fasus of Ibn Arabi.
Yes.
And he also had a dream before Iqbal was born, so he knew the great, future his son would have. Can you say something? Is that true?
This I don't know, but I do know that when Iqbal was around 4 or 5 years old, that is what is written by Javed Iqbal in Iqbal's biography, that there used to be sessions on Muhyiddin Ibn Arabi in their house. Imagine you're 5, and even if you don't understand what's going on, you're having all these words coming into your being, so to speak. So imagine what effect these events must have had on his development later on. So yeah, he had amazing parents. Amazing parents.
And so we see, going from the Quran, I've heard it said, this brings us not really nicely onto the topic of Rumi, because I've heard it said that towards the end of his life, as learned as he was, he only read 2 books, the Quran and the Masnavi of Rumi.
Wow.
And he pays such homage to Rumi, it's unbelievable.
Yes.
To the point where I was very fortunate to attend the Maqam of Rumi in Konya, and behind his museum where he's buried, the tomb, they have an honorary tombstone where it says
I wish I had seen that, because I went to Konya and somehow I didn't. I think no one pointed it out to me, or I didn't know where it was.
I looked for it. I don't know if it's still there, but I've heard it said his request was when he dies to have him buried at the feet of his master Rumi.
Wow.
I've heard,
Okay.
that's what I've heard. I don't have the reference to that, but
Hmm.
yes. So can you say something around Iqbal's? And the reason I'm saying Rumi here is because, as the saying goes, I think it's by Jami, that the Masnavi Hast Quran Dar Zaban Pehri. It's the Quran in the Persian language. So can
Yes.
you tell us something about Iqbal's, the role of Rumi in Iqbal's
You
vision?
know, one thing that we know and I know of, but I haven't read, I wish I would have a tutor and I could go through Javed Nama with a proper teacher, you know. That is one of those things I would love to do. Um, Javed Nama is a Persian, it's in Persian, and it's a poem describing a celestial journey in which Iqbal goes into, you know, the heavens and he comes across all these great historical figures, Mansur Hallaj, I think, being one of them. And the mentor and the murshad and the teacher on this journey is none other than Jalaluddin Rumi. And
Wow.
in fact, Piro Murid is probably in Bale Jibril. It's
Mm,
this poem where Iqbal poses questions to Rumi. He calls himself Murid Hindi, and
mm,
his questions are in Urdu shairi, and then he takes snippets and verses and teachings of Rumi from his Persian work. So it's a very interesting poem. It's half Urdu, half Persian. You know, the questions are posed in Urdu, and then the answers are in Persian. So there is absolutely no doubt that Rumi has played a huge role in
mm,
in Iqbal's uh, uh, you know, this for I don't want to use the word formation, but in Iqbal's development. In
mm,
fact, Iqbal has given his son Javed advice that if you find yourself not having any friends in life,
mm.
take Rumi as your friend.
Wow.
So and if you look at Rumi's poetry, his Raju Sahib, and it's all about ishq. So much
Mm,
so, I had this, you know, it was a very an honor for me that I gave a little talk on Iqbal, Rumi and love,
mm,
Rumi and Ishq, the concept of Ishq at the National University of Modern Languages, along with Shazre was with us. She spoke on Rumi and Tawheed,
mm,
and I did Rumi and Ishq.
mm.
So I got to do a little bit of research on that. And I would like to recite a few
Please,
verses from Rumi
please,
just
you
to
start.
give you a flavor of that. He says, for Rumi, ishq is a standalone concept. It
Mm,
is that mother source of feeling
mm,
that out of which all things that are noble, all things which are beautiful, all the good values of life are born out of ishq. And
mm,
then he says in his poetry, he says, Sharhe ishq arman bagoyam bardawam. If I start talking about ishq, it's explaining about what ishq is,
mm,
and I do it constantly, consistently, forever, sad qayamat ba guzarat o an natamam. A
mm,
100 years, 100 days of judgment will come and pass, and this conversation will be incomplete. So, because he says, "Ze onke," it is because tariq qayamat ra hadas. Even the day of judgment has some limit set on it. You know, like the
mm,
Quran
mm,
says, that day will be a day of 50,000 years.
mm,
Some
mm,
limit God has set.
mm,
Hat kuja anja ke wasfe izadast. Okay,
mm,
how can we put a limit on ishq? It is one of the quintessential qualities of God. And then another place,
mm,
Rumi says, Ishq as tariqo rahe peghambare mo. Ishq is the path of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Is the path of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Ma zadae ishq. We as an ummah, we as a nation, we are
mm,
born of ishq. We are products of ishq. O
mm,
ishq shud madare ma. Ishq is our mother, you know, the
mm,
mother source from where we come. And if you then go to Iqbal, it's just amazing. I was just, you know, collecting my thoughts together for this
mm,
podcast, and it's, you know, just I'm so grateful to God that you know, I got led to this. If you look at Iqbal's poetry, it's sprinkled. It's at the level of his discourse, at the level of individuals, the discourse on ishq at the level of nations, at the level of accomplishments, the way he has understood ishq. I would like to recite a few
Please.
pieces over here. He says, Beqatar koot pada atishe namrud mein ishq. What was it that compelled Hazrat Ibrahim alayhi salam to take such a huge stand against the tyrant of his times? Beqatar, without any fear, koot pada atishe namrud mein ishq. Aqal hai mehve tamasha labe baam abhi. Aqal is still standing at the edge of this fire pit, thinking, should I jump in? Should I not? So what propelled him, what compelled him was ishq. And then he says, listen, and this is from Qizrera, one of my all-time favorite verses. Sidqe Khalil bhi hai ishq. Integrity of Hazrat Ibrahim alayhi salam is born out of ishq. Sidqe Khalil bhi hai ishq. Sabre Hussain bhi hai ishq. And Hazrat Imam Hussein's stand, radiallahu ta'ala anhu, in Karbala is also born out of ishq. Markae wajood mein Badro Hunain bhi hai ishq. In both Badr and Hunain, and see, that is where his role as a historian steps in. He's never, even though he's, when you write poetry, you get carried away, you're looking at the rhyming, you're looking at the language. But with Iqbal, it just flows, because in both Badr and Hunain, the Muslims were outnumbered. Both times, they could have faced a loss, but they came back with an amazing victory. So he says all that he reduces this to the equation of ishq. And then one of my favorite poems, Zawq wa Shauq from Bale Jibril. I would love to recite. It's just 2 ashar.
Please.
I'm not going into too much detail here, but this needs to be read. This is so beautiful. He is addressing the Prophet over here, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He says, "Teri nazar mein hai tamam mere guzishta roz o shab." You are a witness to how I have spent my nights and my days. All those years in Germany, in the UK, back in India, how he struggled. तेरी नजर में है तमाम मेरे गुज़िश्ता रोज और शब, मुझको खबर न थी कि है इल्म नकील बेरतब. He says, I never knew that philosophy, because he had spent so much time studying philosophy that in the end, he says, it turned out to be a date tree. Date trees have very long lives, but they are dry and they have thorns. And they are not, they don't give out a lot of, they give out dates, but it's like ilm nakhil beiratab. It's not a fresh ilm. He's talking about philosophy. It's not fresh. And then he says, Taza mere zamir mein maar kae kohon hua. And this old conflict in philosophy surfaced again in my conscience. Ishq tamam Mustafa, aqal tamam Abu Lahab. And then of course he says, and then if you go on the community level, at the level of civilization, again he talks about ishq. Ishq ke hai mojazat, saltanat o faqr o deen. All these things people have achieved vis-a-vis building empires, vis-a-vis practicing faqr, the faqiri, the great Sufia. Ishq ke hai mojazat, saltanat o faqr o deen. Ishq ke adna ghulam, sahib tajo nageen. इश्क मकानो मकीन, इश्क जमानो जमीन, इश्क सिरापाए यकीन, और यकीन फतह बाब. Ishq will lead you to yaqeen, not just faith, not just iman, but yaqeen, certitude. And once you have certitude, fateh bab, the doors open. You have achieved, you have arrived. It is definitely, there is absolutely no two opinions about how much Rumi has influenced Iqbal.
Beautiful. And if I may just add, I believe the verse is as follows, where he says that Teri namaz mein qiyam nahi aur
Yeah, he says, Shauq tera agar na ho, meri namaz ka imam. He's addressing the Prophet. Mera qiyam bhi hijab, mera sujood bhi hijab, mera sujood bhi hijab. No, mera qiyam bhi hijab, mera sujood bhi hijab. So my own ibadat, my worship will become a barrier for me if it is not for me having you, O Prophet, as my Imam. Just amazing. I mean, you can't really explain these verses.
Yes.
You can only feel them, and they like penetrate your being, you know.
Yes. The one on Rumi, I think he says something to the effect of "Teri namaz mein qiyam nahi ke tu naghma Rumi se begana hai."
Oh, you were going to, okay, I thought you were talking about this. Oh, okay. Yeah.
So for our listeners, he's something to the effect of, you know, even in your salah, the reason you don't have the inner qiyam or the real qiyam, as in standing, is you haven't yet heard the song of or the lament of Rumi. You know,
You
and
haven't
so
passed through his teachings.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Just on that note, you know, I think I'd love to say something around the Prophet, peace be upon him, because he was somebody who was had a very, very deep love and reverence for the Prophet, peace be upon him. Just before we do that, though, and while we're on Rumi, I just want to say something around his relationship with Maulana Jalaluddin Rumi. My understanding, my humble understanding, is it was more than just at the level of reading, you know, somebody who offered him great insights and, you know, resolved any conflicts he may have had, intellectual conflicts. I feel there was something around a spiritual connection. I know the Sufis talk about an Owaisi connection. It's an unseen connection one has with the soul of a saint or a lineage. Sometimes we know Hazrat Awais al-Qarni had that sort of relationship with the Prophet, peace be upon him. But I know there are stories circulating around, for example, maybe Javed Iqbal might have,
some whisperings in the room, somebody having conversation, and Iqbal is all by himself. Yes, I've come across those anecdotes, and because Javed Iqbal has said, I think even in some interviews, that Iqbal was so concerned about the Muslims getting into this sort of discourse, and he was very much against Khan Fahi, although he was in himself, we know at which spiritual state Iqbal was.
Yeah.
So Javed Iqbal said, even though I might be privy to something like this, I will not share it, because Iqbal wanted just action, and you know he was working on this agenda. He was actually against formal ritual sort of Sufism. His Sufism is a very different kind of, where the Qalandar can actually make interventions in the laws of nature, and each person, he says, you know, khulne lage asrare nehani, gaya daure hadith lantarani, हुई जिसकी भी खुदी पहले बेदार, वही मेहदी है, वही आखिर zamani. You know, once you have actualized your khudi, you are the Mahdi. Why are you waiting for Mahdi? You are the potential Mahdi. For someone like that, so definitely there's not one, but I think many such instances which have been narrated by his the person who used to serve him.
Yes.
And others, but I think Javed Iqbal did not want to highlight them. And I know I'm so much into this kind of this, you know, but they say they don't want to talk about it. But there's other stories as well. His meeting with other great, you know, personalities like Khaja Moinuddin Chishti, and you know,
in the spiritual realms. I've heard that too. So I know in the family there's a story around Maulana Rumi appearing to him and asking him to write you know, a poem in the form of the Masnavi or something to that effect. And also when he was in England, he was.
I don't have a difficult time believing this.
Yeah.
It's not something difficult to believe.
And it almost reminds me it reminds me of the Qasida Burda, Imam al-Busayri's connection with the Prophet, peace be upon him. That level of love, although they never met physically, there was a nisbat, there was a connection, you know, in the unseen, which otherwise, how do you explain such depth of love in poems? You know, it's not just from ideas or concepts or story. There's something else being flown. And So can you tell us, while we're on this love, is the love of Iqbal for the Prophet, peace be upon him?
I think the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam is everything. He is Iqbal's everything. If you look at Tarana-e-Milli, when he says, Chino Arab Hamara, Hindustan Hamara, Muslim hai, Hum Watan hai, Sara Jahan Hamara. And then there is this verse where he says, Salare Karwan hai Mire Hijaz Apna. You know, he is the leader of this caravan of, of the Muslim world. Is naam se hai baqi, Aram-e Jahan Hamara. And it's the concept of the love of the Prophet's personality. It's spread throughout Iqbal's poetry. I just love this poem. Sometimes we do this. I do this for the Hajis. I've been doing this for the last 2 years. I used to do it in Zilhaj. It's a PowerPoint presentation on pilgrimage, and there were stories that we heard all our lives, and I didn't want to just not share them. And some of those stories have been handed down and from obscure little books. So I do this, and when I talk about Medina, I use this poem, and I would like to recite a few verses from this. This is about a Haji who's going from Makkah to Medina after the Hajj is over. And the same thing जो हम बात कर रहे थे, that Iqbal has this, he has such amazing general knowledge. He has an eye on historical events. It used to be very difficult to travel to Makkah and Medina for Hajj during, the Middle Ages. So the Ottoman Empire, the government used to put aside a budget as big as a budget for war when the caravan for Hajj used to go from Turkey to the Arab lands, because they used to be highway robbers. They used to rob people, and they used to be fighting, and used to literally, you had to put your life at stake in order to go for Umrah or Hajj. So he knows all that, and he sort of brings it into that poem, and he says, Ek Haji Madine ke raste. And this is in Bange Dara. He says, Kafla loota gaya. So the Kazakhs came, the highway robbers came, they stole everything, and they killed people. Kafla loota gaya sehra mein aur manzil hai dur. So there was a good several hours journey between Makkah and Medina. So the manzil, Medina, is dur, is far. Is beaba yani behre khushk ka sahil hai dur. And this desert is like a dry ocean or dry seabed, and the sahil, the kinara, what would you say that? How would you say that in English? The seashore is far. Hum safar mere shikar dashnaye rehzan hue, bach gaye jo ho ke bedil suwe Baitullah phire. So my fellow caravan travelers, some of them died, and some of them became so scared that they turned back towards Makkah. And then this comes the share, which when you recite, it just shakes your heart. This guy, this pilgrim is standing, and he's facing Medina, and Medina is far away, and he's telling himself, Be ziyarat suwe Baitullah phir jaunga kya? Will I turn towards Makkah without making ziyarah? Be ziyarat suwe Baitullah phir jaunga kya? Aashiqon ko roze mahshar muh na dikhlaunga kya? How will I face all the ashiqs on the day of judgment, when they will look at me and say, oh, he's the one who turned away. He couldn't make the journey. And then he brings the teacher of this ummah that he is. He brings the lesson. He says, look, the one lesson that the Prophet taught us during Hijrat was, Khaufe jaan rakhta nahi kuch dashte paimaye Hijaz. The one who's crossing this dasht has no fear of death. Khaufe jaan rakhta nahi kuch dashte paimaye Hijaz. Hijrate madfoon Yasrab, the one who is buried in Yasrab, his hijrat, this is the lesson that is coming from his hijrat. Hijrate madfoon Yasrab mein yahi makhfi hai raz. This is the secret that is hidden in the journey of hijrat, that crossing the deserts that are coming our way, are coming in our lives, we should not be scared of death. And this is the message that the Prophet is giving. It's just beautiful. It is not just one share or one, he says, Ki Muhammad se wafa tune, to hum tere hain. in Jawab Shikwa, when God says, listen, the ultimate lesson Iqbal gives in Jawab Shikwa is, if you're loyal to the Prophet, ki Muhammad se wafa tune, to hum tere hain, I belong to you. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala belongs to you. Ye jahan cheez hai kya? You're talking about this dunya, law qalam tere hain. Here's the tablet, here's the pen. Write your destiny, write what you want. Everything belongs to you, but on the condition of you being loyal to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So this is, Iqbal is very clear about the centrality of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, not only in the vis-a-vis the religion of Islam, but his centrality as the ultimate creation of God. And he says, Loh bitu, qalam bitu, tera wajud al-kitab. Gumbad-e-aab ina rang, this earth which looks like a marble from the space. Tere wujud mein habab, in front of your existence, this earth is like a bubble. I mean, what can we say about Iqbal's, love for the Prophet and his understanding of the station of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam? I can dare to say that. And of course, none of us can really, I think no human being can really comprehend the station of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. That's why I think it's Khalid who said that I have handed over this function of praising the Prophet to Allah, because only he knows what is the station of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam.
I'm reminded of a story of Sheikh Abu Hassan al-Nadwi, who has written a beautiful book. Maybe it's a very good introductory book in English, actually, on Iqbal. And he was a child, or he was a teenager, and had translated some of Iqbal's poems in Arabic, and was a great lover of Iqbal, who went to visit him as a child, as a young boy, and gave those translations to him. For listeners who may be aware of Sheikh Muhammad Akram al-Nadwi, Sheikh Hassan was his teacher, essentially, because of the Nadwi school that Sheikh Akram is from. So it's said that he would cry just at the mention of Medina or Mecca, and he couldn't make the pilgrimage. And I understand that there was the option of doing the pilgrimage on his way back from Europe. On his way, and he obviously went to Spain, where he wrote the beautiful poem on Masjid Qurtuba. But he felt it would be a lack of adab or etiquette to do.
If it were incidental.
Yes,
exactly.
It would be a lack of etiquette or adab to do that. And so, just the mention of those places would bring water to his eyes. So moving. Right, going on to Iqbal, one of the key ideas is maybe we can discuss two of his ideas, maybe not in depth, but at least, some, let's see what happens. One is the symbol of the ego that he uses many times, Iqab. Can you say something about?
Yeah, yes. One is a very interesting poem. Have you heard of this? I'm sure you have. Abul Ula al-Muadri. He was a jurist.
Right.
And and this poem is, there is a reference to Shaheen in there. And it is about a jurist who never used to eat meat. He never ate meat. So somebody tried to trick him, and they sent him a roasted bird, okay, like a teeter, like I don't know what a teeter is called in English. So here it is, Abul Ula al-Muadri. He says, "Kehte hain kabhi gosht na khata tha Muadri." He was a vegetarian. He was a jurist. Phal phool pe karta tha hamesha guzar awqat. So he used to eat vegetables. एक दोस्त ने भुना हुआ तीतर उसे भेजा. So a friend sent him a roasted bird. शायद कि वो शातिर इसी तरकीब से हो मात. So maybe he'll get tricked and he'll end up eating some meat. So when he looks at this roasted bird, Al-Muarri says, "ए मुर्गा के बेचारा जरा ये तो बता तू. Oh, you poor bird, just tell me this. तेरा वो गुनाह क्या था ये है जिसकी मुकाफात." What did you do that you got hunted and you got roasted and you became somebody's meal? Afsos, sad afsos ke shahi na bana tu. What a tragedy! How tragic that you did not follow the ways of the falcon. Dekhe na teri aankh ne fitrat ke isharat. You were oblivious to the laws of nature. तकदीर के काजी का ये फतवा है अजल से. From the, this is an eternal message, an eternal law of nature. है जुर्म ज़ईफ़ी की सजा मर्ग मफाजात. If in this world you commit the crime of being weak, you will die a sudden death. You won't even know what hit you, what happened. But then there is this reference that why couldn't you be more like a falcon? And then, of course, that famous poem, he dedicates in Bale Jibril a whole poem of 8 verses to the falcon, and how the falcon inspires Iqbal, and how he would like the youth to be inspired by the ways of the falcon. And do you want me to read a little bit?
Please. Yes. An honor.
Shaheen from Bale Jibril. किया मैंने उस, and this is in first person, so the falcon is saying, किया मैंने उस खाकदां से किनारा जहां रिज़्क़ का नाम है आबोदाना. So I have left that world where abodana, where grain is your rizq. Because you see, people, we tend to think of rizq as food, but rizq can be talent, rizq can be opportunities that come your way, rizq can be in the form of knowledge. So the falcon is saying from the word go, kiya maine us khakda se kinara. I've left that world, that place, that earthly place, jahan rizq ka naam hai abodana. Bayaba ki khalwat khush aati hai mujhko. Bayaba is the wilderness. I love the isolation and the, being by myself of the wilderness. Azal se hai fitrat meri rahibana. I've always been like a rahib. Rahib is someone who lives a life of austerity. Na bade bahari, na gulchi, na bulbul. I'm not into springtime and the song of the nightingale and the gardens and the gardener. Na bimari nagmaye ashiqana and the songs of the lovers. Khayabaniyon se hai parhez lazim. I try to avoid those who are settlers, who have settled down. Adaएं हैं उनकी बहुत दिलबराना. Like when people get attached to a certain place and then they settle down and things look really nice. Dilbarana, adaएं हैं उनकी बहुत dilbarana. So I try to sort of cut myself away from that world so that I don't get attracted to attachments, to getting fixed in a place. Hawaii Bayama, oh, my favorite shade. And I will not even attempt to translate it, but I just want everyone to just feel it. Hawaii Bayaba se hoti hai kari. Jawam mard ki zarbate ghaziana. Oy, oy, oy. Like when the ghazi goes into war and he strikes, that strike is fatal. And that power and that fatal strike comes from Hawaii Bayaba, comes from, training yourself in the wilderness, not, in settled areas and cities. I love this line. Hamam o kabutar ka bhuka nahi main. Hamam and kabutar are delicacies, pigeon. I'm not into delicate food like, pigeons and stuff. Ke hai zindagi baas ki zahidana. I am a zahid at heart. I live a life of austerity. I'm not into, delicacies and luxury living. झपटना पलटना पलट के झपटना आहा लहू गरम रखने का है एक बहाना. All this, my flight, my zooming in into the prey. And this is, I remember when our fighter planes used to come in the Republic Day parade, they used to sometimes read this, झपटना पलटना झपट के पलटना लहू गरम रखने का है एक बहाना. It's just an excuse for me to keep myself going. ये पूरब ये पुच्छम चकोरों की दुनिया. This north, south, these directions belong to partridges, these other birds. Mera neel gu asma bekarana. I fly into the, the spaceless skies. Parindon ki duniya ka darwesh hu main. I'm like the darwish of the animal kingdom, the world of birds. Ke shahi banata nahi ashiana. Yeah, the falcon never builds a nest. He is not fixed. He's always on a journey. So for Iqbal, all his messages of being constantly in motion, having high goals, not being getting into luxuries, but living a tough life. All that is in this poem is one of the most and one of my favorite poems, by the way. So I'm really glad you brought that up. Parindon ki duniya ka darwesh, ke shahi. And you know what, Saqib? I did some research because I was like, Iqbal wouldn't just say something like this. So there is a species of falcons who do not make a nest. But just when I went and researched on this, I said, is he right? Or is he just, getting carried away? Indeed, there is. So just like all these, Rumi and all these great thinkers, Iqbal takes a lot of inspiration from nature, from the laws of nature, from nature. I think all these laws of nature are actually also signs of God, These are signs coming from God about how to live life, what is the reality of life. That's why Quran says, you're supposed to observe and think. And
Beautiful. That lends itself to the next idea around which I think would be good to explore. I can start you off maybe with some of the verses I know that have inspired me. And, just building, it's about religious orthodoxy, which I think he was critical of simply because, at the time, the Muslim Ummah in India, having faced colonialism, were not exercising the essence of their religion. In a way, it reminds me of Imam al-Ghazali, who also talked about religious idolatry, where you have the formalists who turn religion into an idol. So they are customs without any spirit. And I think there is a reference somewhere, I can't remember at the top of my head, where Iqbal also looks at religious idolatry. Obviously, he critically evaluates, culture and Western civilization, but he also has a lot to say around, as you mentioned earlier, cultural forms of Sufism, shall we say, which from his perspective have become obsolete, in that they're not rising to the challenge. There's no practical aspect of bringing the divine eminence, into your activity. So, but at the same time, I think he's more traditional than traditional in that he is not cut off from the past. If anything, he's deeply immersed in the Islamic tradition, in Rumi, in his forefathers, in that sort of lineage. So he's not a modernist, as far as I understand. He's not there to simply turn religion into redefine it in terms of modern principles and ideas. So he's not doing that either, but he is challenging Muslims to raise their level of consciousness, take inspiration from their forefathers, and face the challenges of modernity, rise to the stage, rise to the challenge, and be center stage. So one of his criticism of religion, I find it quite fascinating. So he says, there's a few verses, and please do correct me if I'm wrong, because it's been quite some time since I've read him in his Urdu. He says, मानी और मतलब है दोनों की एक ही, मुल्ला की अजान और मुजाहिद की अजान और. Yeah, so the meaning is essentially the same, but the azan of the mullah is one thing, and the mujahid, when he says Allahu Akbar, it's another. And I think that actually, I think in the same poem is the poem around the vulture and the eagle, where he says
किसका जहां और है शाही का जहां, परवाज है दोनों की इसी एक ही फिजा में, किर्गिज का जहां और है शाही का जहां. I think
that's it. Yeah. So the vulture and the eagle fly in the same environment. This is just paraphrasing the meaning, by the way, if anyone's listening. I'm not doing a literal translation. The parvaz, the elevation of the eagle is different. Then he says this beautiful poem, which to me I know he took bay'ah with a number of Sufi, or he renewed his bay'ah. He was a deep lover of, he really admired Sheikh Ahmed Faruqi Sirhindi. He wanted to give a
Oh,
talk.
yes. Jadid Ali Thasani was a huge.
And he wanted to give a talk on Ibn Arabi at Cambridge, I believe. And so he did write to the great saint, Pir Meher Ali Shah, who was lost in an ecstatic sort of retreat and who was very Akbarian. So he says, Ya wasat aflaq mein takbir musalsal, ya khaq ya ghosh mein tasbih ho manajat. वो मजहब मर्दाने खुद आगा ओ खुदा मस्त ये मजहब मुल्ला जमादात और नबातात. I'm not sure how to translate that, but paraphrasing just at least the first couple of lines is that either your takbir resounds in the heavens. Ya wasat aflaq mein takbir musalsal, they sort of echo throughout the heavens. Ya khaq ya ghosh mein tasbih o manajat, or in the arms, in the embrace of dust, your tasbih and your prayers just stay in this realm, i.e. in the either the dhikr you do has a vertical dimension and transcends,
Or it is just,
or it stays on the relative, on the condition. As they say, the Sufis, al-ism huwa al-musamma, the name is the named. So either you are simply at the level of the horizontal, it's just formalism and cultural and religious idolatry, or the vertical eminence of the divine reality has permeated your being. Ultimately, it's him who's doing the zikr of his name. And then he says, wo mazhab mardane khud aga khuda mast. Again, amazing. That was the religion of the men who were self-aware and God intoxicated. Khuda must, God intoxicated and self-aware. Very interesting use of words. Ye mazhab mullah jamadat. So now he's making a distinction. This is the religion of the mullah. Jamadat or nabatat, I'm not sure how to translate that, but vegetable, it's sort of on the earthly realms that it sort of exists. There's no higher flight or deeper inner sort of meaning. And coupled with that poem, it really strikes what he saw as Imam al-Ghazali, I think, as some of the ills of where religion has failed, and that inner dimension has been forgotten, and he was there to sort of remind people, of the depth of religion, I think in what he carries. And that's an example, I think, of how his insights are so penetrating that you are left dumbfounded, and ecstatic, So, sorry, I've given a bit of a long context there.
No.
But Mr.
You said
Iqbal
it so beautiful. No, you said it so beautiful.
Going all night.
You said it so beautifully, and I don't think I have anything to add to that, but he was a huge critic. And if you look at the popular level, and because Shikwa, Jawabi Shikwa are kind of written at the level of the general public.
Yes.
So there is a stanza in there, he says, Waize Qawm, the one who's giving was. Waize Qawm ki wo pukhta khayali na rahi. बर्ख तबी ना रही शोला मखाली ना रही रह गई रस्म अजान रूहे बिलाली ना रही फलसफा रह गया तलकीन गजाली ना रही. Exactly what he was saying. And another place he says something very interesting. He says जिसका अमल है बेगरज उसकी जजा कुछ और है पूरो क़याम से गुजर बादा व जाम से गुजर. So don't think about what is like popularly promised, paradise and the hurs and the tents. He said, just go beyond that. So, but he was absolutely a huge critic of the traditional, the Maulviyat and this whole, and actually there is no clergy in Islam. There is no concept of, an organized clergy in Islam, which is a very big tragedy that such a thing has taken root in the Muslim world. And I think Iqbal was dead against, because he found them to be of limited understanding, very ritualistic, and not getting to the root and the spirit of Islam.
Beautiful. And then the last concept, I think, for today's podcast is that the idea of khudi. And I think there's a lot of, the context is, especially people who've read Sufi books, obviously the emphasis is on being selfless, in a sense of trusting in God and whatever he decrees, being content with it. Iqbal, I believe, and this is my humble understanding, I'm not a scholar of Iqbal, I'm just a student and a lover of his works, is that when he talks about cultivation of the khudi, just for clarity's sake, and there's beautiful poems he's written on ripening the self, he's not talking about the cultivation of the ego as we have in modern self-help books. He's not saying be your best self and develop that. He's not doing that. He's doing something much more deeper, which in my humble understanding, it's actualizing the selflessness of the path, in that you become the servant, the absolute servant of the divine being, which is a very high station. He talks about being very active in the world, and the divine qualities. Please, I'm going to ask you in a minute if you can remember that poem where he goes, "Ye char nasir hai to banda hai Musalman." Jabbar o
Qahhariyo, Ghaffariyo, Quddusiyo, Jabrut. ये
Yeah.
चार अनासिर हों तो बनता है मुसलमान, हर लहजा है मोमिन की नई शान नई यान, गुफ्तार में किरदार में अल्लाह की बुरहान।
Oh.
जिससे जिगरे लाला में ठंडक हो वो शबनम, दरियाओं के दिल जिससे दहल जाएं वो तूफान।
Wow. And so when he talks about cultivating, so the poem you mentioned earlier, "Khudi ko kar buland itna ke har takdeer se pehle," cultivate yourself to such a degree that before destiny is written, Allah asks you, "Tell me, what is it, my servant, you want?" Almost as though Hazrat Uwais al-Qarni, when the Prophet asked Hazrat Umar, Hazrat Ali, who went to see him, that when I die, there will be a man from Qarn, he will come, this is how he will look like. Ask him, O Umar, to pray for the Ummah. Ask him. Yes, whenever he raises his hands, Allah never denies him. So, so what he's essentially saying, I think even along the lines of Ibn Arabi, that the human being is not just the drop in the ocean, but the ocean in the drop, as the beautiful lines of Maula Ali tell us, that you think you're an insignificant speck in the universe, but you contain the whole, I'm just paraphrasing, yeah. And so
is that the same? I'm sorry, what did Hazrat Ali say?
So the quote is, "Your sickness is from you, but you do not perceive it, and your remedy is within you, but you do not sense it. You presume you are a small entity, وَتَحْسَبُ أَنْكَ جَرْمُ صَغِيرٌ, but within you is enfolded the entire universe. وَفِيكَ أَنْتَ عَالِمُ الْأَكْبَرُ. You are indeed the evident book, by whose alphabet the hidden becomes manifest. Therefore, you have no need to look beyond yourself. What you seek is within you, if only you reflect."
Subhanallah. Absolutely beautiful.
Often there's the idea that among Sufi circles that nothing happens without divine will. And so you surrender your will completely to the divine. Almost like a predestination. Whatever happens, it's from the divine. Iqbal seems to be taking that argument but extending it further to saying that there is a fine line, if you develop your will, between the divine will and the human will. They're intermingled, as they said, you did not throw when you threw, it was I who threw. And it reminds me of the poem there's a very important point I think in People on the Way, on Tasawwuf, around tawakkul, because Iqbal takes that idea of tawakkul and then actually says, there's more to it. It's not just subservient to whatever happens as being divine will and being content and grateful. He's saying you're a co-creator in existence. You have the power, the capacity for co-creation. And so the Hikam ibn Atala al-Iskandari, his opening line says, "The sign of relying on your own action is you lose hope when downfall occurs." And so Iqbal again says that na ho na umeed zwale ilm wa arfan hai, umeed marde momin hai khuda ke razdanon mein. Same thing, that those who know the divine are never pessimistic. They're always full of optimism. Could you say more about Iqbal's idea of khudi and being one of creative activism in the universe as in the
Yes.
Khalifa, you know?
I don't know if I'll be able to do justice to that, because most certainly that is Iqbal's biggest contribution, or he's known for his philosophy on Khudi. His most famous ghazal on this subject is "Khirad mandon se kya poochun." I think he's actually talking to Darwin in this. "Khirad mandon se kya poochun ki meri ibtida kya hai?" Where I am coming from, you know, origin of species and all that Darwin had. खिरदमंदों से क्या पूछूं कि मेरी इब्तिदा क्या है, कि मैं इस फिक्र में रहता हूं कि मेरी इंतहा क्या है. I am concerned about where I am going and where I will end. खुदी को कर बुलंद इतना कि हर तकदीर से पहले खुदा बंदे से खुद पूछे बता तेरी रजा क्या है. And actually when I explain this share, I talk about how Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam negotiated on the night of the Miraj and brought down 50 prayers, from the number of prayers from 50 to 5. So as Umeed Safi says, I think it was Umeed Safi in his book Memories of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he says it is actually, this is the greatest law of Islam, namaz, and it is basically a negotiated settlement between the creator and insan, between God and man. They both agreed on a certain number and it came together. You know, the raza of God and the raza of the Prophet match at the figure 5. Bata teri raza kya hai? Till he had pleased the Prophet and agreed to what. So khudi ko kar buland itna ke har takdeer se pehle. And because Iqbal ke paas takdeer bhi jo hai, destiny also, it's questionable whether he's talking about takdeer as law, but he also sometimes talks about the laws of nature and law in terms of this word takdeer. And another place he says, Abas hai shikwaye takdeer yazda. It is a waste of time. You know, Abbas is like, it is useless to complain about your destiny. Abbas hai shikwaye taqdeer yazda. Tu khud taqdeer yazda kyun nahi hai? It is so beautiful. But you know, as you said, it is also not just about losing yourself. There is a very interesting rubai of Iqbal's, and maybe we can end on that. And it's very short. There's a lot of audacity in it. But he has taken Khudi to an ultimate level in this rubai. He says, Khudi ki khalwaton mein gum raha hai. I was so immersed in the khalwat, in the, just thinking about and immersed in myself. Khudi ki khalwaton mein gum raha mein, Khuda ke samne goya na tha mein. So when I was finally brought in front of God on the day of judgment, I was not speaking. I was not saying anything. Na dekha aankh utha ke jalwaye dost. I was so immersed in myself, I didn't have time to lift up my eyes and look at my friend. Qayamat mein tamasha ban gaya main. I was like, people are saying, who is this man on the day of judgment? Who is this man who is just so immersed and so self-occupied and so immersed in himself? So actually, self-actualization is not just about selflessness. Of course, there is an aspect. Asare khudi ramuze be khudi, in the title itself says that. And of course, probably the highest form of khudi would be a form of selflessness and a fana fillah sort of a station. But he has also said something like this.
Beautiful.
Just beautiful, just amazing.
So, Humaira, I was going to ask you, what is your favorite poem by Iqbal? But I feel you've shared so many gems which have
There
come.
are too many. I wouldn't have been able to.
Can you say Iqbal's relevance for today, and how should he be studied? How could he be studied, especially for the younger generation who may not have access to language in Urdu? But as you said, once they understand it, they have a deep thirst. But before we do that, what's his relevance today? Why should we read
I'm finding him exceedingly relevant. In fact, we have raised a lot of money, nearly 2 million rupees, just reciting Iqbal and Attar in the last few months for Palestine. And interestingly, Iqbal used to do that during his lifetime. When he read Jawab-e-Shikwa in 1913, the money that he raised went to the Balkan funds. You know, how Turkey was fighting Montenegro, Greece, Bulgaria, and all these countries. And then there was all this war, and they raised funds for Turkey, the Muslims of India. And the Iqbal would recite a line of a shir, a verse, and then he would stop. And people would say, we want to hear the next line. He would say, okay, I need this much money. And then people and women would give their gold. And it's interesting, 100 years later, we are using his poetry and his works to do the same for Palestine. So that's something really touches me, you know. Hal jazao lehsan illa lehsan. So sometimes when people do something and they're so sincere, their sincerity lives on and on and on years after they pass away. Right now, I would like to just see how relevant Tarana-e-Milli is to the current situation in Palestine. When it says a huge lesson, there's huge lessons in it. He says, Chino Arab hamara, Hindosta hamara, Muslim hai, hum watan hai, Sara jahan hamara, Tawheed ki imanat sino mein hai hamare. Oh my God, I can literally visualize Gaza right now. Tawheed ki imanat sino mein hai hamare. We contain Tawheed, the wealth of Tawheed in our chests. Asa nahi mitana. Namo nisha hamara. It's not that easy to obliterate us. It's not that easy to do away with us. दुनिया के बुत कदों में पहला वो घर खुदा का, हम उसके पासबां हैं, वो पासबां हमारा. We were the first defenders of the Kaaba, so we are the defenders of God's house, and God's house is our defender. Something like that. This cannot really be translated. We can only paraphrase it. Tehon ke saaye mein hum pal ghar jawan hue hain. This really inspires me. He says we are that civilization that was brought up by, you know, under the constant, you know, these military conquests and all these jihad and this kata. दुनिया तहों के साए में हम पलकर जवां हुए हैं, खंजर हिलाल का है कौमी निशान हमारा. And then बातिल से दबने वाले ए आसमां नहीं हम, 100 बार कर चुका है तू इम्तिहान हमारा. That we have been put through these tests hundreds of times, and we have always come out undefeated. So, you know, I can almost imagine Gaza, and because the whole Muslim world was colonized at this time, and there were freedom struggles taking place, this poem is such a source of inspiration. And then he says, Salare karwan hai mere hajaz apna. The leader of a caravan is the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Is naam se hai baqi aram e jahan hamara. And I think he has a huge message for the Muslim world today in his poem Wataniyat, which was written post 1908 in Bange Dara, when he really called out the concept of parochialism and limited nationalism. And he told the Muslims, look, this is not for you. It was actually after the First World War, then the concept of nationalism as we know it today, nation states and rigid borders and all that, it was actually an outcome, and it actually took place after the First World War. So, and it was a new concept, and Iqbal really calls it out. And I think we should end on this because it's very, very important. So I'll just read a few lines from this poem. इस दौर में मैं और है, जाम और है, जम और. Of course, you know, मैं is sharab, is wine, and jam is the goblet, and jam is that the famous Persian king Jamshid. He's saying in these times everything has changed. So there is different wine, different goblets, different everything. साखी ने बना की रविश लुत्फो सितम और, मुस्लिम ने भी तामीर किया अपना हरम और. And the zulm is that the Muslims have built their own, a separate haram. It is not the same haram. Their qibla has changed. Tehzeeb ke azar ne tirshwaye sanam or. And these modern day idol makers, and he calls them Azar, the uncle of Hazrat Ibrahim alayhi salam, who was a famous idol maker. He says, Tehzeeb ke azar ne, this new culture, this new civilization, it has its own idol makers, and they are making new idols. In taza khudaon mein bada sabse watan hai. Among out of all these new ideologies that people are worshipping, in taza khudaon mein bada sabse watan hai. This idea, this concept of limited nationalism. Jo pairahan iska hai, wo mazhab ka kafan hai. The dress of nationalism is actually the kafan of religion. And then he says something that I am in love with. He tells the Muslim world, look, bazu tera tawheed ki quwwat se qawi hai. You are strong, your hands, your arms are strong. Don't undermine your strength because you have tawheed. Bazu tera tawheed ki quwwat se qawi hai. Islam tera des hai. Tu mustafawi hai. Nazara-e dereena zamane ko dikha de. Mustafawi khak mein is butt ko mila de. This idol, this new idol of nationalism, just kill it, just kill this concept, just reduce it to dust. Because you belong to the nation of Islam. Islam tera des hai. Your watan, your base, your country is your religion, and you are a Mustafa. It is just absolutely marvelous. I wish the Muslim world would heed this message today. And except for Yemen, we don't see anyone standing up for the Palestinians. I mean, and I'm talking about nation states, because they all have their own limited, vision, and their own interests are at play here. So I think Iqbal has a huge relevance. He's current, his message is pregnant with, meanings, and we really need to take our lessons seriously.
So, Humaira, thank you so much for joining us on the Hikmah Project podcast. It's been an absolute honor and a pleasure, and you've had me ecstatic throughout the podcast, and with verses of Iqbal, your energy and enthusiasm has rubbed over, and I really
I really enjoyed this conversation. Really, it's not every day that you get to talk about Iqbal in such detail.
Yeah. So, any last words? Any poem? Let me ask you for a share.
तेरा जौहर है तू, तेरा जौहर है नूरी पाक है तू, फरोख दीदाए अखलाक है तू, तेरे सैदे ज़ुबूर फरिश्ताओं हूर के शाहीने शहे लौलाक है तू.